My first summer in the Sierra by John Muir. July 21st. Sketching on the dome. No rain. Clouds at noon about quarter filled the sky, casting shadows with fine effect on the white mountains at the heads of the streams, and a soothing cover over the gardens during the warm hours. Saw a common housefly and a grasshopper and a brown bear. The fly and grasshopper paid me a merry visit on the top of the dome, and I paid a visit to the bear in the middle of a small garden meadow between the dome and the camp, where he was standing alert among the flowers as if willing to be seen to advantage. I had not gone more than half a mile from camp this morning when Carlo, who was trotting on a few yards ahead of me, came to a sudden, cautious standstill. Down went tail and ears, and forward went his knowing nose, while he seemed to be saying, "Ah, what's this? A bear, I guess." Then a cautious advance of a few steps, setting his feet down softly like a hunting cat, and questioning the air as to the scent he had caught until all doubt vanished. Then he came back to me, looked me in the face, and with his speaking eyes reported a bear nearby. Then led on softly, careful like an experienced hunter not to make the slightest noise, and frequently looking back as if whispering, "Yes, it's a bear. Come, I'll show you." Presently, we came to where the sunbeams were streaming through between the purple shafts of the firs, which showed that we were nearing an open spot, and here Carlo came behind me, evidently sure that the bear was very near. So I crept to a low ridge of moraine boulders on the edge of a narrow garden meadow, and in this meadow I felt pretty sure the bear must be. I was anxious to get a good look at the sturdy mountaineer without alarming him, so drawing myself up noiselessly back of one of the largest of the trees, I peered past its bulging buttresses, exposing only a part of my head, and there stood neighbor Bruin within a stone's throw, his hips covered by tall grass and flowers, and his front feet on the trunk of a fir that had fallen out into the meadow, which raised his head so high that he seemed to be standing erect. He had not yet seen me, but was looking and listening attentively, showing that in some way he was aware of our approach. I watched his gestures and tried to make the most of my opportunity to learn what I could about him, fearing he would catch sight of me and run away. For I had been told that this sort of bear, the cinnamon, always ran from his bad brother man, never showing fight unless wounded or in defense of young. He made a telling picture, standing alert in the sunny forest garden. How well he played his part, harmonizing in bulk and color and shaggy hair with the trunks of the trees and lush vegetation, as natural a feature as any other in the landscape. After examining at leisure, noting the sharp muzzle thrust inquiringly forward, the long shaggy hair on his broad chest, the stiff erect ears nearly buried in hair, and the slow heavy way he moved his head, I thought I should like to see his gait in running, so I made a sudden rush at him, shouting and swinging my hat to frighten him, expecting to see him make haste to get away. But to my dismay, he did not run or show any sign of running. On the contrary, he stood his ground, ready to fight and defend himself, lowered his head, thrust it forward, and looked sharply and fiercely at me. Then I suddenly began to fear that upon me would fall the work of running. But I was afraid to run, and therefore, like the bear, held my ground. We stood staring at each other in solemn silence within a dozen yards or thereabouts, while I fervently hoped that the power of the human eye over wild beasts would prove as great as it is said to be. How long our awfully strenuous interview lasted, I don't know, but at length, in the slow fullness of time, he pulled his huge paws down off the log, and with magnificent deliberation turned and walked leisurely up the meadow, stopping frequently to look back over his shoulder to see whether I was pursuing him. Then moving on again, evidently neither fearing me very much nor trusting me. He was probably about 500 pounds in weight, a broad, rusty bundle of ungovernable wildness, a happy fellow whose lines have fallen in pleasant places. The flowery glade in which I saw him so well, framed like a picture, is one of the best of all I have yet discovered, a conservatory of nature's precious plant people. Tall lilies were swinging their bells over the bear's back, with geraniums, larkspurs, columbines, and daisies brushing against his sides. A place for andrels, one would say, instead of bears. In the great canyons, Bruin reigns supreme, happy fellow whom no famine can reach, while one of his 1,000 kinds of food is spared him. His bread is sure at all seasons, ranged on the mountain shelves like stores in a pantry. From one to the other, up or down he climbs, tasting and enjoying each in turn in different climates, as if he had journeyed thousands of miles to other countries, north or south, to enjoy their varied productions. I should like to know my hairy brothers better, though after this particular Yosemite bear, my very neighbor had sauntered out of sight this morning. I reluctantly went back to camp for the Don's rifle to shoot him, if necessary, in defense of the flock. Fortunately, I couldn't find him, and after tracking him a mile or two towards Mount Hoffman, I bade him Godspeed and gladly returned to my work on the Yosemite Dome. The housefly also seemed at home and buzzed about me as I sat sketching and enjoying my bear interview now it was over. I wonder what draws houseflies so far up the mountains. Heavy grass feeders as they are, sensitive to cold and fond of domestic ease. How have they been distributed from continent to continent, across seas and deserts and mountain chains, usually so influential in determining boundaries of species, both of plants and animals? Beetles and butterflies are sometimes restricted to small areas. Each mountain in a range, and even the different zones of a mountain, may have its own peculiar species. But the housefly seems to be everywhere. I wonder if any island in mid-ocean is flyless. The blue bottle is abundant in these Yosemite woods, ever ready with its marvelous store of eggs to make all dead flesh fly. Bumblebees are here, and are well fed on boundless stores of nectar and pollen. The honeybee, though abundant in the foothills, has not yet got so high. It is only a few years since the first swarm was brought to California. A queer fellow and a jolly fellow is the grasshopper. Up the mountains he comes on excursions. How high I don't know, but at least as far and high as Yosemite tourists. I was much interested with the hearty enjoyment of the one that danced and sang for me on the dome this afternoon. He seemed brimful of glad, hilarious energy, manifested by springing into the air to a height of 20 or 30 feet, then diving and springing up again and making a sharp musical rattle just as the lowest point in the descent was reached. Up and down a dozen times or so he danced and sang, then alighted to rest, then up and at it again. The curves he described in the air in diving and rattling resembled those made by cords hanging loosely and attached at the same height at the ends, the loops nearly covering each other. Braver, heartier, keener, carefree enjoyment of life I have never seen or heard in any creature, great or small. The life of this comic redlegs, the mountain's merriest child, seems to be made up of pure, condensed gaiety. The Douglas squirrel is the only living creature that I can compare him with in exuberant, rollicking, irrepressible jollity. Wonderful that these sublime mountains are so loudly cheered and brightened by a creature so queer. Nature in him seems to be snapping her fingers in the face of all earthly dejection and melancholy with a boyish hip, hip, hurrah. How the sound is made, I do not understand. When he was on the ground, he made not the slightest noise, nor when he was simply flying from place to place, but only when diving in curves, the motion seeming to be required for the sound. For the more vigorous the diving, the more energetic the corresponding outbursts of jolly rattling. I tried to observe him closely while he was resting in the intervals of his performances, but he would not allow a near approach, always getting his jumping legs ready to spring for immediate flight, and keeping his eyes on me. A fine sermon the little fellow danced for me on the dome, a likely place to look for sermons in stones, but not for grasshopper sermons. A large and imposing pulpit for so small a preacher, no danger of weakness in the knees of the world while nature can spring such a rattle at this. Even the bear did not express for me the mountain's wild health and strength and happiness so tellingly as did this comical little hopper. No cloud of care in his day, no winter of discontent in sight. To him, every day is a holiday, and when at length his sun sets, I fancy he will cuddle down on the forest floor and die like the leaves and flowers, and like them leave no unsightly remains calling for burial. Sundown, and I must to camp. Good night, friends three. Brown bear, rugged boulder of energy in groves and gardens, fair as Eden. Restless fussy fly with gauzy wings stirring the air around all the world, and grasshopper, crisp electric spark of joy enlivening the massy sublimity of the mountains, like the laugh of a child. Thank you all three, for your quickening company. Heaven guide every wing and leg. Good night, friends three. Good night.